the web is boxes within boxes within boxes. And because of that, there's very common design patterns now that have come up with like your container, then your row, and then your columns, and then your content. And while I think that's, it did its purpose, because of things like grid and more importantly, subgrid, we are now able to move past that. And the result of it not only is that it's simpler markup, but I also think it's actually more intuitive when you're looking at it to understand exactly what's going on. It enables us to have a few less classes along the way, which is nice. And it actually also makes things a little bit easier to play around with and to manipulate and to change and to break out of the grid when you need to break out of the grid. And that's exactly what we're going to be exploring today. We're going to be looking at this page that you can see on the screen right now, and we're going to be exploring it and seeing how we can make this type of layout using subgrid with a very flat, nice looking markup, and also all the different ways we can manipulate it, play with it. So if that sounds good to you, make sure you stick around. Hi there, my friend and friends, and I'm so glad that you've come back to join me for yet another video. And if you're new to my channel, my name is Kevin, and here at my channel we learn how to make the web and how to make it look good with weekly tips, tricks, and tutorials with a very strong focus on CSS. And this video is my continuation of Subgrid Awareness Month. An awareness month because it's something that people just aren't aware enough of, and I want to raise the awareness of it so that the browsers outside of Firefox actually, maybe people can start showing an interest in them, and then the browsers will pick up on that interest and start putting resources to it. If you've missed the other videos in the series, I've linked to them down below just because they sort of give you a better idea of how to get started with Subgrid. But if you just want to watch along with this one, you're more than welcome to, and let's just jump right into the code. We're not going to beat around the bush too much here. And you can see here I've set up a bit of a layout that doesn't, it's okay. We're going to make it look a lot better though. And what we want to first start with is I'm going to be doing this all on my main grid. And the type of thing I'm going to do on this one, some parts of it you could definitely do with like different grids throughout the entire thing. But that, again, it's this idea that we can have one main grid that can just rule them all is just so nice. And it becomes really versatile, really easy to play with things in different ways. And so yeah, we're going to look at how we can do that. I do like doing mobile first, so we're going to shrink this down and we're going to worry about the mobile first, layout first. So the first thing we have to do is a display of grid. So we actually have a grid, which won't change very much yet. And you can see I have styled some things up down here just really fast, but there's nothing much going on. It's really just, my typography, my background colors. That's all I've done so far. There's nothing else going on yet. So display of grid on there, and then we're going to say that we're going to have some grid template columns. And if you haven't used grid at all before, what I would recommend is maybe, I do have some videos that cover grid itself, the basics of grid, so you can maybe understand a little bit more of what I'm doing here, because I'm not going to explain every single step along the way with the basics of this. I really want to specify and look more at how we can use subgrid to expand and really take advantage of, I really think that subgrid is it's what we thought grid was going to be, and it opens up new doors and better ways of working, in my opinion. So here I have my grid template columns, and you can see it sort of breaks my whole layout. And if we look in here, we can see in my markup, I have my hero, my sales points. All of these are the direct children of my main grid. So we can sort of fix this weird thing that just happened really quickly with a main grid and select all the direct children and say that their grid column is a 1/-1, which allows them to then refill and go back to exactly where we started, which you might be saying, well, Kevin, what's the point then? So we're going to get there pretty quickly. The next one I'm going to do is a little bit strange, but this is where we're sort of setting the stage, because we want all of these guys here to be part of my subgrid, and we want them all to take advantage of the subgrid. Now this could be something where instead of setting it up on here, you could have another class that would say a subgrid class, let's say, or an inner grid class. That you could use, so like an inner grid, if you didn't want every single one of these to actually become one. So I would still do this, so everything gets positioned properly, and then you could have an inner grid here. Because of the layout that I'm doing, and because I want all of the children to be on there, I'm then going to come in and say that we first have to say a display of grid, and then I'm going to say that my grid template columns are subgrid, which then means that and you can see it breaks my layout once again. We go through, but now all of those sections are now taking advantage of the initial grid that I set up here. So actually we can even turn on my dev tools, and I know they're off screen, but this is, here we go. This is my main grid that you can see has been turned on. And if I go into my subgrid of my hero, you can actually see that it looks exactly the same as before. And when you turn on a subgrid in Firefox's dev tools, it also turns on the main grid as well. So you can see I have my two little 1rems on the side, and then I have my main content area that is in the middle. And this is one spot where I'm not super happy with this, but I mean, it works. So we're going to choose all the great-grandchildren. So what we want to do here is we're going to say that the grid column is now, and we look at our line numbers, we have a 2 here and we have a 3 there. So we have like the 1, 2, 3, 4. From the main grid, we can use those because we have our subgrid going. So we can say 2 over 3, or we could say 2 over -2. And I mean, realistically, we could even just do a 2 and it's going to work there. But I like being explicit for whatever reason. And just in case you have a different grid setup, maybe it could work. Now, the first question I think that might come up from something like this is if we look down a little bit, or it might be like, why do this when we could just do the same thing here? And that is just because I'm treating the one rem that's on the sides here as sort of like a container replacement, if that makes sense. So the 2 sides become my one rem, or like the padding that I would have on the sides with a container at smaller screens. And then the middle area is like the width of the container itself. I don't have any containers. If I look inside my hero here, I just have the content of the hero. Or if I look in my more stuff here, because naming stuff is hard, you know, I just have my stuff that is in there. I don't have a container, a row, anything like that set up. So it is a little bit strange, I agree, doing this step compared to what we used to usually do. And you might be saying this is a lot more setup right now. First of all, I think this is a system, like a repeatable pattern you'd use. You wouldn't recreate this every single time. And as we go through this, we're actually going to look at how we can easily customize it to change how many columns you have, to change the way different things are working in it. Custom properties are just the best. We're going to get there at one point. Now, there is one issue that we run into is we just have this like ever-growing container where the content can actually stretch the whole way across because I set this up with a 1FR. And then we have our 1 rems on the side. So the first thing I'm going to do to fix this a little bit is we're going to set a min-max here. And so the minimum is 1 rem, and then I'm going to use 1 FR here. We're going to grab that same thing and plop it over here. So the 2 outside ones are like that, and then we're going to throw a min-max here. The min can be 0, or you could have a number there if you wanted. I'm just going to put 0, so it can technically shrink all the way down. And then my maximum in this case, we'll go with the 60 rem. And you could use CH or whatever you want. Basically, these aren't going to kick in. These FR units aren't going to kick in until we've hit this 60 because of the way FRs work. So at the smaller sizes, it does that. And then when we get to this bigger size, you can see it locks in with sort of it's acting just like a container would if you had a container. So already, I think that's a pretty cool start of what we can do with all of them being controlled with one main container. Effectively, instead of having to have all those sub-containers throughout each section. But now is where the real fun begins, where we're going to set up our column system. This is actually going to cause some problems with our column system as well, just because it's going to sort of conflict with a little bit of the things we're going to have to do. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually assign a media query here, and we're going to give this a max width. And I'm just going to use 650 because it works with this layout. If you have a different size, and again, this number could be modified depending on the project and everything. So you're going to see that here it's working, and then when everything's in a break right now, but we're going to solve that as we go. And so what we want to do now, and this is where things are going to get a little bit interesting, because obviously things are breaking a little bit. And this is actually where this -2 comes in, and why I didn't want to just use the 2 here as well. Is here right now we said that our container was, the container area was as small as 0 and maxed out at 60. I want this to work, but I actually want there to be columns involved in here. So what we're going to do is we're going to come here and we're going to say repeat. And if you're not used to the syntaxes and all these things because you're not familiar with grid itself, I'm not going to dive too deep into how this is working, but I do have videos on the regular grid syntax that you can check down in the links. They're linked down below, and there should be a card popping up too. So you can learn more about just the regular grid stuff, and then this should all make a little bit more sense. And so now I'm saying that I have 6 columns. They can shrink down. I'm not too concerned with them getting too small, and their maximum size is 10. So 10 times 6 is 60 rem. So, you could do the math here, and this number could also be customized for your project. Every project could have a different number. Why don't we set that up now? So here I'm going to put column count, and we can throw a 6 there. And then we would just come here and say that this is my var column count, because custom properties are the best. And it just means you don't have to dive into this, because this is a little verbose. There's a lot of things coming in here. It can be a little bit hard to read. But if you come across this and you go main grid column count is 6, you know exactly what's happening. So I do think using custom properties like that could be really handy. And just to show you, if we jump that up to a 10, we'll have 10, or the very common 12. Whatever number you put here is how many columns you have. And for this project, 6 is perfect. So now I have the 6 columns, and this is where this 2 over -2 is really helping me, because I'm going from one side all the way to the other, and it's acting as my full container there. And you can see that everything is working. And when I get past that 650 here, we're not relying on this to keep our content centered. And we're going to sort of break into things, because obviously everything sort of falls apart at that point, and we don't want that to happen. And what we're actually going to do is start here and work our way down and fix all these parts. And then we're going to jump all the way back up to the top just to show that we can sort of break out of things and take advantage of the grid even more and come up with more fun layouts through all of this. And a lot of this is going to be done with utility classes. So the first thing I'm going to do, and I am going to put this in a media query, media min width of 650, just so it's once my layout, here it's when the layout breaks and everything changes. We're going to start doing other things with our layout that are more interesting. So for this, I'm going to create an even columns class that we're going to do there. And then we're also going to have a few other utility classes that are based on this even columns class. If you wanted to be really verbose, I guess you could say even columns and then dot how many columns. So you could say 2 columns. And then we could have another one that would be the same thing, even columns dot 3 columns, and do something with that. The extra specificity here shouldn't be an issue. So if you like that it's a little bit more clear, you could do that. And it also sort of forces these classes to be used in conjunction with that. I'm going to do it like this just because I like keeping things simple if I can, or lower specificity, but it shouldn't cause an issue one way or the other. Now with the even columns, we actually need to do a few things here for this to work. And again, this is a little bit more set up on at the beginning to be able to take advantage of this later on. So you might be looking at it going, Kevin, I could do something a lot simpler using a flex grid system or even a regular grid system. The setup takes a little bit of time, but again, this would be something you could bring project to project to project, and you wouldn't have to reset it all up. And most of the time, if you're using utility classes and doing that, it's always a lot more work at the initial stages that you then don't have to worry about ever again in the future, which is nice. And custom properties make our lives just so much better. But for these even columns, I'm going to first actually want to select all the grandchildren. And this is going to take a minute, and then you're going to see everything sort of fall into place. So let's do a really simple one first. We're going to say grid column is, we'll start simple, and we're going to spice things up. So I'm going to say grid column is a span 2. And this is eventually going to come into here, but I'm just going to show you why I'm putting it here to begin with. And let's go into here where this is my sales points. So here we're going to call this also even columns. And all of a sudden this area should sort of come back into play a little bit, and it's a little bit better. Now this first one looks really broken. You're going, Kevin, that's not spanning 2. But don't forget, we're on this grid where the first column is only this one little rem thing here. So it's actually spanning from there and going to here, which is an issue that we're going to address soon. But this is where some of the fun power comes in with this, is even columns. What I'm actually going to do here is a span of var column width. And it looks a little weird, but then we can actually come in our 2 columns area, and we can use our custom properties for this. So here I can say that my call width is 2. And then here I can come in and I can say that my call width is 3 and 3. And then, so here's a 2 column, so it's even columns and it's 2 columns, and it's going to set up and it's going to work. There we go, and it's back to where we were. Now this can even become more powerful because we can also base all of that on this column count and do some math on that. So it automatically updates. If you change your column count, all of these things can automatically change too. So if we want to have something that's going to be, oh, and you know what, I screwed this up. 2 columns should actually be a 3, and this one should actually be a 2, right? Because we have 3 columns here. Whoopsie. But again, we can do the math. So something is 2 columns, it's going to be a calc of var column count, which I think is what we called it. Oh, I did column the whole thing, not call. Column. So var column count and divided by 2. And then we could take this here, and then same idea, call width is divided by 3. And then if we wanted 4 columns, which wouldn't really work in this case, but you could have it divided by 4, divided by 5. In this case, a 6 column grid only really works with 2 or 3. So that would depend a little bit on your project, or if you just always set up with a 12-column grid, which is very popular because of the divisions you can do, but you get the idea. That by updating this number now, so if I do a 12, nothing here should change. It's all updated, right? So now these are spanning 1, 2, 3, 4 on my grid. And then if I change this over to a 24 for some reason, they're all spanning. It shifted a little just because the spacing changed on them to squeeze them in, but they're spanning the same amount that they were before. I drop it back down to a 6 and it's still working, and it's filling in exactly what I want it to. So this is sort of like the master controller of my entire system. Now, we do run into this issue with this guy that's like, we don't want anything that's actually living in this area right here. And I mean, you could say that maybe this guy could be outside the media query and it could actually benefit, but it causes more trouble than it's worth because the grid column is a shorthand for grid column start and grid column end. So we could actually come in and we want to update these a little bit here. So on my even columns, I am going to take this and actually we'll duplicate it 2 times. 1, 2. And we're going to choose the first child, and we're going to have 3. We're going to have a last child, and in case we ever have one and that has an only child as well. This maybe you could have something else that's not even columns, but I'm going to put it here just because you might, it's one thing. It could still be in an even columns. So we'll see how we could use that. But again, maybe you have a different name that you want to give this, and then you don't have to worry so much about the only child on here. So what we could actually say here is that the grid column first child is going to be a 2 over. So we're starting at line 2 and then we're spanning 2. The last child is going to be a span that, but over -2. And then the only child, we're actually going to come back to that. We don't need this one yet, but we'll see what we can do with that one. So you can see that this is currently working. We're going to fix this up even more and make it a bit more robust. But you can see that that's working for my 3 columns there. And one thing I didn't do actually, let's go back to my main grid. Let's just add a column gap of 1 rem, just to give us our spacing. And because of the way the gaps work with subgrid is our subgrid, the items, even though they're on a subgrid, they respect that gap, which is kind of handy. So we've set all of this up with our even columns. We have our 2 columns, we have our 3 columns. So let's come on and fix this one. So on here, we would say that it's even columns and it's 2 columns. And if we go and take a look, now we have the 2 columns that are setting up like that. Now you might be wondering, well, what if I want an offset, or I want things that like narrower together or more spread out? That's a good question. So we could definitely build that into all of this and take advantage of custom properties to be able to do it. Which does mean making a few more changes here that are kind of interesting. And so what we're going to actually say on the even columns is I'm going to set up some defaults here and push custom properties a little bit more. There's a heavy use of custom properties coming in this. So if you're not used to custom properties, there's a link in the description below that does have a playlist that dives a little bit deeper into them. Because what we're going to say is for all of these, it's the column width. We've already set that up. We've already defined those that are coming here. I've called these column widths. It could also be like column size. So like a column size of 2, column size of 3, whatever. Column width works in this situation. But the next thing I'm actually going to do, I'm going to set this as a default that we can overwrite really easily. And we're going to change these numbers right here into custom properties. But what we're going to do, and this is where it's kind of interesting. So we're going to say var, and we'll say that it's call start, comma 2, which means if the start doesn't exist, we're going to use the 2 value. But if this does exist, we'd use whatever this custom property is instead. In this case, it doesn't exist yet. So we're just going to ignore it. And for the -2 on this side, we're going to do a var column start, we're going to do a calc of var column start times -1. So whatever this number ends up being is what this one becomes. And that's my variable starts here. Okay, and then we're going to wrap. And then the default here, once again, will be a 2. So if it doesn't know what number your column start is, and that's, so this like becomes like a de facto column end effectively, but it just makes sure that we're always centering our content. And so the cool thing with that then is I want 2 columns here, but I also want to change things a little bit. So I can actually change all those things by coming into my more stuff. So this is where you can like customize on a section by section basis. So you come in and you could say more stuff is actually going to be a little bit different. More stuff, I need to customize my even columns and my 2 columns. So I still want 2 columns, but I actually want the column width to be 2. I want to stick with that size, the same size as I have here. And I'm also going to switch my column start to be 3. And now let's turn on my grid. And now, so what this has done is we're saying that we want the width of them to span across 2 columns, or maybe that could even mean column span, whatever you want it to be. So it's spanning across 2, and I've changed my column start to be starting at line 3, and because my 3 is here, it's automatically going to go a -3 the other way. So -1, -2, -3, and it centers it in that space. So it's still technically 2 columns, it's still even columns. You could even come in with this and leave the 2 columns off if you are specifying this here, and it should still work. There we go. So that becomes, up to you. You could just specify the even columns because you're coming in and modifying things a little bit. And there you go. So both options are available to you. And that's one of the reasons it's a little bit more robust is you could play around with this on an individual basis, or you could have your utility classes that you're using for most things and then completely change it in other parts. Or you could even set up, it could even be, you could have something like this set up. Instead of a 3 column, it could be like a 2 column narrow, and you could have a utility class for that if it's a repeating pattern that you have all the time. But if it's a one-off, then you can easily modify just a couple of custom properties and completely change that area. So we could even take advantage of that for my newsletter sign up that looks really broken right now. So let's come in and add my even columns there, columns. And this is where, because we've done all this work to set it up, things become a lot easier to do. So .cta, and let's scroll back down. So my CTA, we could say that it's a column width of, and actually let's just look inside my CTA, because here I just have 1 div. So there's only 1 item that's living inside of here. So we could say that the column width here is a 6, and that the call start is a 3, and that should help set everything up. And actually, this should actually be a 4 maybe. Oh, and I was wondering why it wasn't working. It's because of my only child that I put here. Where I didn't, because this one's all on its own and there's nothing else in here. Actually, do we need that? I was thinking we were going to need the only child, but as long as we use the even columns, there we go. We don't even need it. So we could just play around with this, or you might want to have something set up so that it's always the same if it's, your only child. But here, so this becomes something, so you can have a 6, and this could be starting at your 2, so it's taking up the full width of the area. This could become a column width of 4, and that becomes a 3, so it's more centered. And again, this is on a simpler grid. It could even be, this could even be a column width of 2, column width of 3. You'd have to play around with your numbers a little bit in this case, and I don't think this is going to center. And this is, yeah, it's not working out properly just because this is going to the -2, so it's being pulled all the way over to the side. Maybe if I did a 4 there, actually. Yeah, it doesn't work because I'm on a 6 column grid. So if you were a 12 column grid, things become a little bit easier to customize. And of course, like on an area like this, maybe you don't actually want to use subgrid, right? So this could be an area where it's nice because you would just have your CTA. You could have a width set on this div here and just have a margin 0 auto to center it. And it doesn't have to live on your grid. And that's where having the, you could have your subgrid or inner grid class that you're using instead to only use it where you want to. And that's what I like about this type of system is it becomes easy to break out of the grid or not use the grid or use the grid however you see fit. But in this case, I think I'm going to stick with the grid because it's looking at what we're doing. So let's just fix that up a little bit. So we're going to say the column width is a 4 and it's starting at a 3. And again, if you're not sure and you're having trouble balancing things out and actually getting them to line up where you want them to, of course, we need my even columns on that for it to actually work. But this is one of those ones where, and we're going to fix that, remember, don't worry. But it becomes one of those things that like come in here and turn on your line numbers so you can see your line numbers, and it just makes your life so much easier than trying to guess and hope that things line up where they should go. And one thing I like about this is you don't need a container, right? We have these full width systems. We don't need to nest anything. And just to show you that we can even break out of that type of system, another thing we could do is on this bottom area, I'm calling it full split to say that it's like a full width split area. And so let's have some fun on that one. And this could be definitely, and it's a very common design pattern that you see. So we're going to go with a full split. And on this one, instead of doing, we could try and come in with the even columns. I'm not even going to mess with that. The big difference with my full split is we don't want it to actually be, we want to take advantage of this. Whereas all the other ones, we've said we don't want things going here. We want them to be in one. So on my full split star, we can start here by saying that it's a grid column of 1 over negative 1. And that would get it to take up like the entire space, right? And this is an image, and actually we're going to do something with the image anyway. So let's say that this is my star img, not img. What am I doing? If the child is an image, what we could do here is then just say that it's a width 100%, height 100%, and then object fit cover, just so it doesn't sort of mess things up. At smaller screens, now it's going to be filling up from one side to the other. If I didn't have this on here, we get like this space that's going to be coming, and you're going to see we don't really want that. So we can do our full split. That's going to make sure this area is full width. Now, of course, when we do this, we don't want them to be full like that at small screens. That's fine. We want them stacking on top of each other, but at large screens, we want them to go next to one another. So what we're going to do is on the full split here, we're going to add our even columns. And if you remember, that opens up the world of having, and I'm calling this full split because I'm definitely keeping this as a 2-column. You could have other classes like this that could open up things to 3 or 4 columns as well. And what I'm going to do on here is we're going to say that my call start is a 1 and that my call span, width is a 4. And so now we get this very common design pattern, right? Where this is here and this is set up over here. I think it looks pretty cool. I have already set up, if we look in here, I have a vCenter class as well. So the vCenter class, if I find it, is just, I'm setting a grid and a center so the text is centered and not stuck to the top. So that's why that's looking the way it is there. But you'll notice that's a very common design pattern. And even I wouldn't normally, or we've been doing decent practice on this from the beginning. So here we could just add like BG dark P6 or something for padding 6. So again, some utility classes that you might build into your system. So we have a BG dark, could be background of black and a color, and a color of white, just so we're doing things very quickly. And so it looks like that. And then we'd want to have my P.P6 could be, that would be like P6 is for padding. So like padding 6 units or whatever. It's just a big padding. I don't know. So we'll go with like a 2 rem or maybe even a 3 rem. So actually maybe we'd call that P3 just so it's 3 rem the whole way around. And that just keeps our text from touching the very edges of the screen. Now there is one issue where we get this line that's coming all the way around like that. And that's actually because this vCenter is being applied to a paragraph. So I am going to add this here of a margin of 0 just to get rid of that. That's on the top and the bottom. And then it's because we have a gap that's in the middle here. And this is coming because if you remember from the very beginning, let's turn on my grid. When we did my main grid, we set a gap up on it. And the gap, we said that the gaps are respected, but you can actually turn those off. So that's really easy to do. I just have to find that full split that I created. And then here where I have my, that would actually be on the full split itself. On the full split itself, so full split, we would come in and we would say that the gap is 0. And we're removing the gap. So even though the main grid has a gap, we can easily overwrite that or play with it and change it for other types of things and start falling into these common design patterns. And so let's turn off all my overlays. And now, I mean, I think it's looking pretty good. A very simple website following very common design patterns that we run into, but we haven't done the top yet. And this is where you can, I've done these even columns because that's a very common thing that you'll see, but sometimes we don't want to have that. And we have some more interesting areas or more interesting things. So I'm going to set that up. These are all more utility classes. So let's just, well, we have full splits and everything, but we're just going to come here and do my hero. I'm not worried about organization right now. So if we look at my hero, I am going to want to keep things looking like this at smaller screen sizes because I think that looks perfectly fine on mobile. And then when the layout breaks, so now that I think of it, we're going to pull that out of there. And I do have my media query set up. So I'm going to put all of this in the media query. So we're just using one for now. And then we have our hero coming in. And this is where we can have fun and just put things where we need to on the grid. And so let's start here. We're going to say my hero title, I think, is the first one that we need. And we'll say it has a grid column of, I want it to go pretty far across. And this, again, is usually easier if you have your numbers on, but you can see now I have it going sort of further across than that. And then we'll show a little thing that can happen just in case you're not familiar. I'm going to choose my hero image. And what I want is these to overlap. So I'm going to say that this is a grid column, and we're going to run into a small problem, but say like it's a 4/7. So they should overlap, but the image is going to get pushed down because by default, grid doesn't want things to overlap. So we're going to come on both of these and say both of them have a grid row of 1/2. And that means that they live in the same space and they're actually going to overlap. And one nice thing with grid is you can add a Z index without needing positioning. So Z index of 2 will bring that on top. Nice and cool, right? I'm also going to add here, I just realized I did on the image, I want this to be a -1. I want to go all the way to the end. It might not look like it's doing it, and maybe 7 was all the way to the end. We're going to have to play with that. But the other thing I'm going to do is my object fit, so width 100%, height 100%, and then the object fit cover, just to sort of make sure that it gets cropped and doesn't overflow. And then we get this type of thing going on. I think I'm actually going to make this one a grid column of 5 instead of 4. I think that's going to look a little bit nicer. There we go. So that's looking pretty good, and then it breaks, and then it comes back this way. Another thing, just to make it look a little bit more fun, is my .hero. We're going to give this a padding of 3M0, just because I think it looks nicer when we have some space at the top there. Just personal preference. We get that type of look going on. Cool. The next thing is placing these, and so we have my hero image. The row, we're going to have it stretched down actually. So we could do grid row 1/3, or I could do 1 over span 2. They both would give me the same type of look. I just want to make sure that I have other things, so when I bring this text and other stuff down, and you can see I group my button and my text here just so I can move these as one unit. So then that's why we can come down and say my hero body has a grid row. And I like being, sometimes you don't need to be explicit with these, but I'm just going to say it's a 2. And then I'm going to say that the grid column is a 2 over, and my image is starting at 5, so I could go as far as 4 with this, and then it would be living in that space. You could even say it's a 3 and play with that, or even we could go up to 5. It's starting at 5, so we could end it at 5, so you can play around with that. I think a 2/4 looks pretty good, so it's sort of in this space over here. And you know, one thing, my image is going to infinitely grow because of it's living in that FR space that's over there. There's, I could set a max height on it to prevent that, but I think what I'm actually going to do here is we're going to go to 5/8 because we have 9 lines in total. And that way it's actually going to, once we hit that maximum width, it's going to lock in and it looks a little bit better. But again, if you like that idea of it spilling out the side, super easy to do, which is hard to do with a container. So again, you could actually do the -1 here just to show you. And this is where these it's a popular thing to do that. And then here we could set a max height of say like 60 vertical height or something like that, just so it never gets bigger than that. And then you get this look of this image that breaks out of the container on the right, which is often really hard to do, but Grid opens up, making that actually really easy to do. And it's really cool because we can have all of this set up on one single grid. We don't have to recreate new grids. And then as we add new content, and again, a lot of this, like it was a little bit long to put together, but just to show you, we could come in here with a new section on my site, and we'll do it right here. We can just come in with a div with a class of even columns. We'll do a 3 columns, and then in there we'll have, we'll say div times 3. Each one of them has lorem 10 just for some text, and just like that, you get 3 even columns. And then you could come in with the same thing, but instead of 3 columns, it could be 2 columns, and we can get rid of this guy. And now we have a 2-column system, and I know there's no padding and stuff like that, so it's harder to see what's happening. Now there is one downside to this entire thing that could technically pop up, which is what happens if you start coming in with like too much content. And by too much content, I mean like you did a 2-column system, but you come in with 4 divs or 5 divs. The way I've set this up, because I kept it relatively simple, it's going to break into here, and that sort of doesn't look as nice. There could be a way of, there are 2 solutions to this though. One of them would be actually wrapping this in another div, which is sort of what I've been trying to avoid, just to show the power of subgrid. And then having a subgrid on your subgrid. You could always do something like that and make it work really well where it's actually nested inside. The other solution that could come up though is you do a little bit more work where you do a little bit more work in setting up all those utility classes where we initially set up our even columns and all of this. We're selecting our first child, our last child. You could also set things up, and it would be actually really dependent on this, like a 2-column, 3-column, because you could set this up with nth childs instead. So you could do 2 columns. We'd actually want to get rid of this, and 2 columns, and then nth child of even, and you could set the even ones coming up where it's only, you know, they're always set up on that side, and then the odd one actually be the other way. The odd is the first one, so the odd one is always starting here, the even one is always starting at the next part, and then on a 3-column system it would be the same thing. You can choose, you know, every third child and use your minuses and pluses to select the right children, and that would actually get it to flow. So if you want to give yourself a bit of a challenge and see if you can get that to work, you can fork off this pen, give that a shot, and definitely share it with me if you manage to pull it off, either on Twitter or over on my Discord. It's the best place where you can reach me and share these types of things with me. And while this is something with a different design pattern you can do without Subgrid, we saw last week a solution that Subgrid offers us that isn't really available without it, and we're going to be seeing the same thing next week. If you don't want to miss that video and you haven't yet subscribed, please do consider subscribing. And with that, a really big thank you to Zach, Randy, and Stuart, who are my supporters of Awesome over on Patreon, as well as all my other patrons for their monthly support. And of course, until next time, don't forget to make your corner of the internet just a little bit more awesome.